Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a really complex topic, sex and gender disorders. And to do that, we're basically going to build a clinical map using the same framework that actual psychologists use. It's a way to bring some clarity to what can be a really personal and often misunderstood part of life.
So you might be wondering, what's the big question here? Well, for clinicians, it all comes down to this. How do you tell the difference between just, normal human variation and something that's actually a clinical disorder? Where's that line? That's the core question we're digging into.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll lay out the basic framework. Then, we'll hit the three big areas on our map. Dysfunctions, which are all about sexual response, then paraphilias, which focus on arousal, and finally, gender dysphoria, which is all about identity.
All right, let's get into it. First up, the framework. To even start building this map, you gotta know the major landmarks, right? See, clinicians don't just lump all this stuff together. They have some really clear categories to help make sense of it all.
Basically, the main guide they use, the DSM-5, breaks it all down into three big buckets. You can think of them as the three main continents on our map: sexual dysfunctions, paraphilic disorders, and gender dysphoria. Each one is a totally different territory.
So, our first stop is sexual dysfunctions. And the most important thing to get right off the bat is that this has nothing to do with who you're attracted to. Nope, this is all about the how, the physical mechanics, the challenges the body can have responding during sex.
And here's something that might really surprise you. Look at how common this stuff is. We're talking 43% of women and 31% of men in the US dealing with this at some point. So this is not some rare, obscure thing. It's a huge part of the human experience, and it can cause a lot of real distress for people.
Okay, so how do experts even think about this? Well, they use this classic model, the sexual response cycle. It's got 4 stages: desire, then excitement, then orgasm, and finally, resolution. Pretty straightforward, right? A dysfunction is basically a roadblock somewhere in those first 3 stages.
And what's really cool is how specific problems plug right into this cycle. So, if the issue is in the desire phase, you might get something like male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. If it's in the excitement phase, that could be erectile disorder. And in the orgasm phase, you have things like early ejaculation. See how it all fits? It's a super logical way to organize it.
Okay, time to move on. We're heading to a totally different part of the map now: paraphilic disorders. So we're leaving the land of physical response, and now we're talking about the what. What is it that's actually causing the arousal? And this right here, this is probably the most important point in this whole section. Just having an unusual sexual interest, a paraphilia, is not the same as having a disorder. It only becomes a clinical disorder when it meets certain criteria. It has to cause major distress, mess up your life, or, and this is the big one, it has to put you or someone else at risk of harm.
So let's make that line crystal clear. An interest might be about, say, non-human objects or certain role-playing scenarios. That's one thing. It tips over into a disorder when it's either causing the person a ton of personal grief or when it involves someone who isn't consenting. That's why, for example, pedophilic disorder is automatically a disorder. There's no gray area, because it's built on a foundation of non-consent and harm. That's the key: consent and harm.
All right, we've reached our final landmark on the map: gender dysphoria. And this is a huge shift. We're not talking about sexual response or arousal anymore. Now we're talking about something much more fundamental: a person's core sense of who they are. It's about that deep conflict between your internal gender identity and the sex you were assigned when you were born.
And this quote, it really nails the clinical definition. It's a pattern in which people feel that they have been born to the wrong sex. That phrase captures that core feeling, that intense need to have your body match who you know you are on the inside.
But we absolutely have to mention that this is a really controversial diagnosis. You know, a lot of people, experts, and especially folks in the trans community, say, hey, this isn't a disorder. It's just another way of being human. For many, getting that clinical diagnosis is just a practical step, a key you need to get medical care. But the idea of labeling it a pathology, that's still a huge debate.
So now, let's zoom out and look at our whole map. You start to see a theme that connects all these different continents, right? Whether it's a dysfunction, a paraphilic disorder, or gender dysphoria, it's almost never caused by just one thing. It's always this complicated mix of biology, like hormones and genetics, psychology, like anxiety or trauma, and the sociocultural world we live in. And that leaves us with one last big idea to chew on. This map that we've just walked through, well, it's not permanent. It's not set in stone.
It's constantly being redrawn as science learns more, and, maybe even more importantly, as our society's ideas about what's normal change. So what counts as a disorder today might be seen completely differently tomorrow. The map itself is always evolving.